Cleopatra did not vanish when Egypt collapsed. She did not disappear with the banners, or the fleet, or the final surrender. She survived the war. What she entered next was something colder. In early August of 30 BC, Roman soldiers crossed the threshold of the royal palace in Alexandria. They did not come with execution orders. They came with instructions. Not to kill her, to keep her. The doors were closed behind them. Not slammed. Sealed. Corridors were reassigned. Guards were placed at measured distances. Messengers were filtered. Objects were counted. Removed. Logged. Outside, the city adjusted almost immediately. Shops reopened. Ports resumed work. Temples continued their rituals. The fall of Egypt did not arrive with fire. It arrived with paperwork. Inside the palace, something very different happened. Time stopped moving forward. Cleopatra remained in her own residence, but ownership had shifted. The buildings still held her furniture. Her clothing still hung in familiar places. Her attendants still moved through the rooms. But the structure itself had been redefined. It was no longer a seat of power. It was a controlled environment. Roman sources describe it carefully. Sentries were posted to prevent self-harm. Food was inspected before delivery. Sharp objects disappeared. Mirrors were removed. Cosmetics were searched. This was not confinement. It was preservation. Cleopatra was allowed to walk, but only within approved areas. She could speak, but only to approved people. She could send messages, but only after reviewing. She could request items, but approval took time. Everything required permission. And permission required waiting. That waiting was the point. For 20-1 years, Cleopatra had ruled Egypt. She had spoken directly to generals, priests, merchants, kings. She had negotiated with Julius Caesar. She had commanded fleets. She had stabilized famine-struck regions. She spoke languages most Roman elites never learned. None of that mattered now. She could not persuade a guard who had no discretion. She could not threaten a soldier who answered to Rome alone. She could not leverage alliances that had already been dissolved. Every tool she once used to shape outcomes had been removed. What remained was her body. And Rome knew exactly what that body was worth. Requests to meet Octavian were acknowledged, then delayed. Letters were received, then held. Proposals were logged, then suspended. Nothing was refused. Nothing was decided. Roman authority did not operate through confrontation. It operated through time. Each unanswered message reinforced the same truth. Cleopatra could no longer initiate events. She could only respond. Her daily routine dissolved into uncertainty. Meals arrived late, then early, then late again. Attendants rotated without explanation. Rooms she had walked through for decades were suddenly closed. The palace became a map of permission. Green zones, red zones, neutral zones. She was not imprisoned. She was reorganized. While Cleopatra waited, Rome worked. Administrators began cataloging Egyptian assets. Tax records were examined. Borders were redrawn. Officials were interviewed. Egypt was being converted from kingdom to province. At the same time, Cleopatra herself was being rewritten. This did not begin with her capture. It had started years earlier. After Actium, Roman propaganda slowly erased her idols. Coins stopped carrying her image. Official language shifted. She was no longer named as queen. She became the Egyptian. The woman. Her role as ruler vanished from the record. Her role as threat expanded. By the time Alexandria fell, her identity had already been processed. Her body was simply the final piece. On August 3rd, Octavian entered her palace. He did not arrive with advisors. He arrived with scribes. The room had been cleared, furniture rearranged, guards positioned. This was not diplomacy. It was documentation. Cleopatra spoke. She justified her alliance with Antony. She offered access to treasuries. She proposed terms for her children. Octavian listened. He acknowledged. He neither agreed nor refused. The meeting lasted less than an hour. When he left, nothing had changed. No promises, no deadlines, no mercy. But the meeting achieved its purpose. Cleopatra believed negotiation was still possible. As long as she believed that, she would wait. As long as she waited, Rome could prepare. And Rome needed time. The waiting changed her more than defeat ever could. Cleopatra had lost battles before. She had lost allies. She had lost territory. Loss was familiar. What she had never experienced was irrelevance imposed from the outside. Days passed without markers. No proclamations. No sentencing. No formal declaration of her status. The silence itself was deliberate. Roman power did not announce conclusions until every variable had been neutralized. And Cleopatra was still a variable as long as she believed she had options. She replayed the meeting with Octavian in her mind. His posture. His pauses. The way he acknowledged her words without responding to them. He had not negotiated. He had audited. That realization settled slowly, like sediment sinking in water. She had been offering terms. He had been confirming compliance. As long as she believed she was still part of the decision-making process, she would behave predictably. She would wait. She would hope. She would conserve herself. Rome needed her alive, calm, and passive. Not because she mattered, because she was useful. She noticed the smallest changes first. The gods rotated more frequently. Faces changed. Accents shifted. The men watching her were no longer Alexandrian auxiliaries. They were Roman professionals. Their posture was different, less reactive, less emotional. They were not guarding a queen. They were monitoring an asset. She stopped asking questions. Every question reminded them she still believed conversation was possible. Silence made her less visible. Instead, she observed. She noticed how messages were delayed by exactly the same number of hours. How food arrived at times that prevented regularity. How even her sleep was subtly disrupted. Irregularity weakens planning. She knew that tactic. She had used it herself on rivals. Now it was being used on her. Her children were the final confirmation. At first she told herself the separation was temporary, a security measure, a transitional phase. But when Latin replaced Greek in their lessons, she understood. This was not about safety. It was about conversion. Not religious conversion. Identity conversion. Rome did not erase conquered deletes by killing their heirs. It absorbed them. Her sons were being neutralized through obscurity. Her daughter was being prepared for usefulness. Cleopatra's Helene would live. That much was clear. But she would live as Rome required. Cleopatra understood something then that no Roman had bothered to explain. Her death was not the threat. Her survival was. If she lived, she would be displayed. If she was displayed, she would be defined. If she was defined publicly, she would be fixed permanently. Rome would not just defeat her. It would decide who she had been. That was the moment when the calculation shifted. Not how to escape. Not how to fight. How to deny Rome the final step. She began thinking not like a ruler but like a problem Rome had not anticipated. Rome's entire structure depended on control over sequence. Capture. Transport. Display. Archive. Break any one of those steps, and the system still functioned. Break the sequence itself, and the narrative fractured. She could not prevent her capture. She could not prevent her children's absorption. She could not prevent Egypt's annexation. But she could interrupt the display. She could remove the centerpiece. Her value to Rome was not political anymore. It was symbolic. She was the final image in a procession that had not yet occurred. And images require presence. Once she understood that, the waiting changed again. It became preparation. She knew the gods were watching for violence. They were watching for despair. They were watching for rash action. They were not watching for patience. Cleopatra did not act suddenly. She did not collapse. She did not plead. She complied. She ate when food arrived. She spoke when spoken to. She rested when permitted. Compliance reassured Rome. And reassurance created gaps. Those gaps were small. But small gaps are enough if you only need one moment. She did not need to escape. She did not need allies. She only needed to deny Rome completion. By the time Roman preparations accelerated, by the time ships were being readied and routes finalized, she had already reached her conclusion. If she lived, Rome would own her image forever. If she died on their terms, Rome would still own it. But if she exited before it ran sport, before spectacle, before voice, the narrative would be incomplete. Rome could still substitute. But substitution is weaker than possession. When her death came, it was quiet. No announcement. No witnesses invited. Roman sources would argue over details later. A snake. A poison. A pin. The method did not matter. The timing did. She died before Rome could move her, before Rome could parade her, before Rome could force her silence into public ritual. And Rome responded exactly as she expected. They did not cancel the triumph. They replaced her. An image took her place. An effigy, controlled, mute. Her children were marched instead. Alive, visible, bound. That was the message Rome wanted remembered. Egypt was not destroyed. It was absorbed. Cleopatra was not defeated. She was concluded. For 2,000 years the image endured. The woman on the couch, the serpent, the theatrical end. What did not endure was the process. The weeks of controlled waiting, the administrative erasure, the systematic removal of agency. That part was never meant to be remembered, because it reveals something more dangerous than conquest. It shows how power does not always need violence. Sometimes it only needs time, procedure, and replacement. Cleopatra did not lose Egypt on the battlefield. She lost it in a quiet palace where nothing happened, until everything was already decided. If you want more history like this, the kind that was never meant to be examined this closely, subscribe to Crimson Historians. There are many more stories where the real ending was buried long before the final moment. After Cleopatra's death, Rome moved quickly to stabilize the silence. The palace in Alexandria was cleared within days. Rooms that had held her presence were emptied. Servants were reassigned or dismissed. Records were sealed. There was no public mourning sanctioned by Roman authority. No state funeral. No acknowledgement of loss. Grief, like loyalty, was now politically dangerous. Egypt was formally declared a Roman province. Its administration was transferred not to the Senate, but to Octavian personally. This detail mattered. Egypt was not treated like other conquered territories. It was not absorbed into the republican framework. It became the private possession of the man who would soon be Augustus. Cleopatra had ruled Egypt as a monarch. Octavian would rule it as a resource. Grain shipments were secured first, gold reserved second, religious institutions last. The temples remained open but stripped of political influence. Priests continued rituals, but only under Roman oversight. The old symbols survived, emptied of authority. This was Rome's preferred method. Do not destroy the structure. Hollow it out. Reuse it. Egyptian coins were reissued with Roman iconography. Cleopatra's image vanished from circulation. Her name disappeared from official documents. She was not condemned in Egypt. She was simply removed. Rome understood something fundamental about memory. Condemnation creates martyrs. Erasure creates silence. The Roman narrative did not need Cleopatra to be hated. It needed her to be simplified. And so the stories began to shift. Roman poets synthesized her luxury. Roman historians highlighted her influence over men. Roman moralists framed her as excess incarnate. This framing served multiple purposes. It justified Octavian's war. It absolved Rome of responsibility. And it transformed the geopolitical conflict into a moral fable. The war was no longer Rome versus Egypt. It was Rome versus temptation. Mark Antony became weak because of her. Rome was endangered because of her. Order was restored by removing her. This narrative was effective because it was easy. Complex women threaten historical simplicity. Reducing them restores control. Cleopatra's intelligence was recast as manipulation. Her diplomacy as seduction. Her strategic alliances as emotional dependency. The fact that she spoke 9 languages disappeared. The fact that she stabilized Egypt's economy vanished. The fact that she ruled longer than most Roman generals held command was ignored. Rome did not argue against her achievements. It replaced them, and replacement is harder to challenge than denial. Because you cannot refute what is no longer discussed. Her children's lives illustrate this perfectly. Cleopatra Selene grew up in Rome. She was educated. She was protected. She was positioned. But she was never allowed to speak publicly about her mother. Her marriage to Juba was political theater. A former captive king ruling a former captive kingdom. To absorb lineages joined under Roman supervision. Their coins bore symbols of legitimacy, but not independence. Egypt was never mentioned. Alexander, Helios, and Ptolemy Philadelphus faded even faster. They did not die dramatically. They disappeared administratively. No scandal. No execution. Just absence. Rome excelled at this. Violence was expensive. Silence was efficient. By the time Augustus formally became emperor in 27 BC, Cleopatra was already a myth, not because time had passed, but because narrative had been finalized. And once finalized, narratives rarely reopen. For centuries, Roman historians dominated the written record. Greek sources that contradicted Rome were marginalized. Egyptian records were fragmented, unranstalled or destroyed. What survived was what Rome allowed to survive. The Cleopatra remembered by later generations was filtered through Roman eyes. A woman defined by men's reactions to her. A ruler remembered only in relation to lovers. A sovereign reduced to spectacle. This was not accidental. Rome feared female authority that did not require Roman validation. Cleopatra had ruled without Rome's permission. That was unforgivable. So Rome ensured that her image would warn rather than inspire. Behold what happens to women who rule too boldly. Behold the danger of foreign power. Behold the cost of defying Rome. And because the story was compelling, it endured. Shakespeare amplified it. Painters dramatized it. Cinema repeated it. The ass became inevitable. The couch became iconic. The romance eclipsed the reality. But the truth remained buried beneath procedure. Cleopatra did not die in a moment of passion. She died at the end of a process. A process that stripped her of time, of agency, of narrative control. Rome did not need to kill her publicly. It needed to manage her privately. And that is the part history rarely teaches. Empires are not only built through conquest. They are maintained through administration. The most effective violence leaves no scars. Cleopatra understood that too late to save Egypt, but early enough to deny Rome absolute victory. She chose the only exit that disrupted the system. Not because she was romantic, not because she was irrational, because she was strategic. Her final act was not surrender. It was denial. Denial of spectacle. Denial of display. Denial of Rome's final word. And Rome never forgave her for that. That is why her image had to be controlled forever. That is why the woman who ruled for 21 years is remembered for how she died, not how she governed. History did not forget Cleopatra by accident. She was replaced deliberately. And replacement, once accepted, becomes tradition. If you want to keep uncovering the moments where history was rewritten rather than recorded, stay with Crimson historians. Because the most important stories are not the ones with dramatic endings. They are the ones where power quietly decided what you were allowed to remember. The replacement worked because it felt complete. By the time Augustus stood before the Senate and announced the restoration of the Republic, Egypt had already been folded into the Roman imagination as something finished. Not ongoing, not contested. Finished. Cleopatra's story had been sealed before it could fracture into alternatives. That is what made it powerful. History is not controlled at the moment of victory. It is controlled in the months that follow, when documents are written, when monuments are commissioned, when silence hardens into fact. Cleopatra's palace became a Roman administrative center. Her private chambers were repurposed. Her audience halls were stripped of symbolism. What had once been a space designed to project sovereignty became a building designed to process grain shipments and tax assessments. Physical space follows political meaning. When power changes hands, architecture remembers first. The Roman prefect who governed Egypt reported directly to Augustus, not the Senate. Egypt's wealth flowed straight into the imperial household. This was unprecedented. No other province was handled this way. Egypt was too valuable to share. Cleopatra had understood that value intimately. She had ruled Egypt not as a decorative monarch, but as a manager of resources. She had overseen grain distribution during famine. She had stabilized currency. She had restructured tax systems that had collapsed under corruption. None of that survived in the Roman narrative. Competence was dangerous to Rome's story. If Cleopatra had been competent, then Rome had not defeated chaos. It had displaced order, so her governance disappeared. In its place came caricature. Roman writers emphasized excess because excess justifies conquest. If Egypt was decadent, then Rome was corrective. If Cleopatra was indulgent, then her removal was moral. Moral conquest is always easier to sell than economic exploitation. Augustus was careful. He did not openly vilify Cleopatra in official state records. He let poets and moralists do that work. He let implication replace accusation. That distance preserved plausible dignity. Officially, Rome had defeated Antony. Cleopatra was collateral, and officially, she was the warning. and warnings must be memorable. That is why her image endured, while her policies vanished. That is why her death became symbolic while her life became decorative. This pattern did not end with Cleopatra. Rome perfected it. Quiet kings were allowed to rule as long as they ruled quietly. Queens who ruled independently were absorbed, neutralized, or redefined. Female authority without Roman mediation was always suspect. Cleopatra was dangerous not because she was powerful, but because she was self-sufficient. She did not need Rome's endorsement to rule Egypt. Rome could tolerate many things. That was not one of them. Centuries later, historians would debate whether Cleopatra truly loved Antony, whether she truly used seduction as strategy, whether her death was suicide or coercion. These debates missed the point. They argued over emotion while ignoring infrastructure. The real question was not how she died. It was why her survival became irrelevant. Rome had created a system in which Cleopatra's presence no longer mattered. Her death did not change outcomes. Her survival would not have either. That is the most complete form of defeat. When your enemy no longer needs you alive or dead, only absent. Cleopatra understood that in the final days. She was not choosing between life and death. She was choosing between two kinds of erasure, one slow and public, one immediate and controlled. She chose the one that disrupted sequence, not enough to save her legacy, enough to fracture Rome's satisfaction. And Rome responded by doubling down on narrative. The effigy in the triumph was not a concession. It was a correction. If the real Cleopatra could not be paraded, a version would suffice. That version would be easier to manage anyway. The effigy did not speak. It did not resist. It did not complicate. It showed Cleopatra as Rome wanted her remembered. Passive, defeated, theatrical. The children in chains reinforced the message. This was not revenge. It was accounting. Rome did not humiliate them to punish Cleopatra. Cleopatra was already gone. It displayed them to show continuity. Conquest was not chaos. Conquest was orderly. The dynasty ended cleanly. The future belonged to Rome. Cleopatra's later life proves this. She ruled as queen. She minted coins. She exercised authority, but always within Roman parameters. Her kingdom existed because Rome allowed it. Her power functioned because it posed no threat. She was successful precisely because she was contained. Her mother had not been. That difference explains everything. Over time, Cleopatra's true achievements became footnotes. Her failures became headlines. This was not because sources were lost. It was because sources were curated. Roman history survived because Rome won. Egyptian history survived in fragments because Egypt was conquered. Those fragments tell a different story. They show a ruler who navigated impossible constraints. A woman balancing Roman ambition, Egyptian tradition, and dynastic survival. They show strategy where Rome claimed passion. They show calculation where Rome claimed seduction. But fragments are easy to ignore. Narratives are harder. And Rome's narrative was elegant. It reduced complexity. It assigned blame. It justified power. That narrative outlived Rome itself. Empires fall. Stories remain. Cleopatra's final captivity reveals something enduring about power. True domination does not require chains. It requires control of time, space, and memory. Rome did not need Cleopatra to confess. It did not need her to submit publicly. It simply needed her to stop shaping events. Once she could no longer act, she could be replaced. And replacement is the empire's most refined weapon. Because what is replaced is not mourned. It is forgotten. Cleopatra was not forgotten entirely. She was remembered incorrectly. That was enough. And that is why this story matters. Not because Cleopatra was exceptional, though she was, but because the mechanism that ended her authority is still in use. Power still neutralizes threats by managing narrative, by delaying decisions, by redefining space, by removing agency without visible violence. Cleopatra's story is not ancient. It is instructional. It shows how history can be rewritten not by lies, but by selection. What is recorded? What is omitted? What is repeated? What is archived? She lost not because she was defeated militarily, but because she was administered. Rome turned governance into spectacle and spectacle into memory, and memory did the rest. If history has taught us anything, it is this. The most dangerous moment is not the battle. It is what happens after the battle, when the victors decide what the battle meant. Cleopatra lost that battle, and Rome has been telling the story ever since. If you want to keep uncovering these moments, where history was not simply recorded but engineered, stay here. There are many more stories like this. They are quiet, they are procedural, and they are still shaping the world you live in. The consequences of that engineered memory did not stop in antiquity. They shaped how power itself would be understood for centuries. Cleopatra's defeat became a template, not a military one, but an administrative one. A lesson in how to neutralize an adversary without turning them into a rallying symbol. Rome learned that killing a ruler was crude. Displaying one was risky. Replacing one was optimal. That lesson was refined, exported, repeated. Later empires did not need Roman legions to learn it. They inherited it through law, ceremony, and record-keeping. Through archives. Through official histories. Through the careful framing of who mattered and why. Cleopatra's story endured because it was useful. It taught that resistance could be romanticized into irrelevance. That sovereignty could be rebranded as indulgence. That political agency could be reduced to personality. This is why her intelligence became secondary to her appearance. Why her alliances became affairs. Why her administration became gossip. None of that happened accidentally. Rome had no interest in debating Cleopatra's policies. Policies invite comparison. Comparison invites critique. Rome preferred moral judgment. Moral judgment shuts discussion down. It is easier to say she fell because she loved too deeply than to admit she lost, because Rome was becoming an empire and Egypt was in the way. That's simplification became tradition. By the Middle Ages, Cleopatra was a cautionary tale. By the Renaissance, a tragic lover. By the modern era, an icon detached from context. Each retelling stripped away structure and replaced it with emotion. Because emotion entertains. Structure index. And structure is exactly what Cleopatra's final weeks reveal. Not drama. Not chaos. Not despair. Procedure. She was processed like a territory. Her movements mapped. Her acts as controlled. Her influence reclassified. Her future scheduled. Even her children were reassigned as assets. Rome did not improvise this. It applied a system it would use again and again. That system required patience. Rome did not rush Cleopatra's end. It slowed it. Slowness creates compliance. Compliance creates predictability. Predictability creates control. Cleopatra was not weak. She was contained. That distinction matters. Because it reframes her final decision. It was not surrender. It was refusal. Refusal to be completed. Rome wanted closure on its terms. She denied them that. But denial is temporary. Narrative is permanent. Rome adjusted. The effigy solved the problem. An image could be archived. An image could be repeated. An image could not contradict. And so Cleopatra became an image. An image carried through Rome. An image carved into memory. An image taught to generations who never knew the woman behind it. Her absence made that possible. Her silence made it durable. And silence, once normalized, becomes truth. The greatest irony is that Cleopatra understood history better than most of those who wrote it. She knew how symbols worked. She knew how spectacle shaped belief. She knew how Rome communicated power. That is why she did not flee blindly. That is why she did not plead publicly. That is why she did not stage a last stand. She recognized that Rome's victory was already administrative. The only variable left was representation. She removed herself from that equation. It was not enough to save her legacy, but it was enough to complicate Rome's satisfaction. They never paraded her alive. They never forced her to kneel. They never heard her speak in the forum. That absence haunted the triumph. So Rome filled it. With art. With poetry. With myth. Over time, those replacements became reality. Cleopatra's actual governance vanished from common knowledge. They remember that Egypt remained stable under her rule. That famine was mitigated. That trade flourished. That she commanded loyalty for 2 decades in a volatile region. Instead, she's remembered for a couch and a snake. That is not an accident of storytelling. It is the outcome of power deciding what deserved preservation. And this pattern did not end with her. History is full of figures who were not destroyed, but redefined. Leaders whose achievements were minimized. Rulers whose authority was reframed as excess. Movements whose goals were reduced to personalities. Because once you reduce a threat to a character flaw, you never have to address the threat itself. Cleopatra was not dangerous because she was seductive. She was dangerous because she was effective. Rome could tolerate many things. Effectiveness without submission was not one of them, so Rome archived her as something else. And that archive endured longer than any monument. Even today, when Cleopatra is discussed, the conversation often begins where Rome wanted it to begin. With romance, with scandal, with spectacle, rarely with governance, rarely with administration, rarely with the mechanics of power. That is the final consequence of her captivity. Not her death, but the success of her replacement. History remembers her, but not as she was. And that should unsettle you, because it means history is not only written by victors, it is edited by them. Cleopatra's story teaches us to look for what is missing, for the weeks between defeat and death, for the silence between decisions, for the moments when nothing dramatic happens but everything changes. Those are the moments where power does its most lasting work. Cleopatra ruled Egypt for 20-1 years. Rome ruled her legacy for 10,000. And unless we examine how that happened, Rome is still winning. If you care about the parts of history that were deliberately flattened, delayed, or replaced, stay here. There is more beneath the surface. There always is. And here is the part most people never confront. Cleopatra's story is not exceptional. It is exemplary. What Rome perfected with her was not conquest, but post-conquest management. Not how to defeat a rival, but how to own the meaning of that defeat forever. Once you see that, you start noticing the pattern everywhere. Empires do not fear resistance in the moment. They fear memory. They fear what defeated people might remember, repeat, or reinterpret once the dust settles. So the real work begins after the banners come down. Cleopatra's final weeks were not about keeping her alive out of mercy. They were about keeping her alive long enough to finish the paperwork of domination, the cataloging of rooms, the reassignment of guards, the controlled delays, the supervised visits with her children. None of that was random. It was psychological decompression, a way of easing a sovereign into irrelevance without triggering defiance. Rome understood something modern power still understands. If you crush someone too fast, you create a martyr. If you humiliate them publicly, you create sympathy. If you imprison them harshly, you create resistance. But if you wait them out, if you drain their options, if you make action impossible without appearing violent, you don't destroy them, you dissolve them. By the time Cleopatra understood that she was no longer a variable in Rome's plans, the plans were already irreversible. Her children were gone. Her treasury was sealed. Her titles were ignored. Her communications filtered. She was still breathing, but the system had moved on without her. That realization is unbearable for someone who is lived by influence and calculation. Because influence only works when someone is listening. And Rome was no longer listening. This is why the method of her death has fascinated people for centuries. Snake, poison, hairpin. Everyone wants a mechanism, but the mechanism is not the point. The point is timing. She died at the exact moment when survival no longer changed the outcome. That is not impulse. That is clarity. Cleopatra did not choose death because she was afraid of Rome. She chose death because she recognized that living had been rendered meaningless by design. Rome had engineered a future where her body existed, but her agency did not. And that is a far more terrifying form of defeat. After her death, everything proceeded smoothly. Too smoothly. The triumph was rescheduled. The effigy was constructed. The children were paraded. The Senate applauded. No crisis. No interruption. No uncertainty. That smoothness is the till. It tells you Rome had already rehearsed her absence. The empire did not react to Cleopatra's death. It absorbed it. And absorption is the ultimate imperial skill. Cleopatra's children are the final proof. They were not killed. They were not punished. They were reprecipited. Raised Roman. Educated Roman. Married Roman interests. Alive but redirected. Rome did not erase Cleopatra's bloodline. It redirected it into harmless channels. Cleopatra Selene became a queen, but never a threat. Her sons vanished quietly without scandal, without legacy. That is how empires end dynasties without bloodshed. They let them continue in forms that no longer matter. And then they control the story. For centuries, Rome's version of Cleopatra went unchallenged because it was the only one preserved at scale. Egyptian records were destroyed or ignored. Local perspectives were dismissed. Roman historians dominated the archive, so the image endured. The woman reclining, the serpent poised, the tragic gaze. A ruler reduced to a moment of aesthetic drama, which is exactly what Rome wanted, because drama distracts from systems. Drama turns conquest into theater. Systems reveal responsibility, and responsibility is dangerous. If Cleopatra is remembered as competent, Rome looks imperial. If she is remembered as foolish, Rome looks justified. So Rome chose foolish, and history repeated it. Until now. Because once you understand Cleopatra's final weeks, as administrative captivity, the myth collapses. You see the gods not as protectors but as archivists. The palace not as a residence but as a container. The delays not as indecision but as strategy. You see a woman who is not defeated by poison, but by procedural inevitability. And you start to ask harder questions. How many other figures were neutralized this way? How many legacies were reshaped by delay instead of violence? How many narratives survive only because they were useful? History teaches us battles. It rarely teaches us what comes after. But what comes after is where power becomes permanent. Cleopatra's story survives not because she lost. It survives because Rome won the archive. And unless we interrogate that archive, we keep inheriting Rome's conclusions. Cleopatra did not die when Egypt fell. She died when Rome finished deciding who she would be allowed to be. That is not ancient history. That is a warning. Because the most effective form of domination is not execution. It is replacement. And it is still happening. If you want to keep uncovering the moments where history was quietly edited instead of loudly written, stay with this channel. The surface story is never the whole story. It never was. And this is where the story truly ends. Not with Cleopatra's death, but with our choice about what we do with what remains. Cleopatra was not silenced by poison. She was silenced by completion. Rome completed the process before her body stopped breathing. It completed the conquest of Egypt. It completed the neutralization of her children. It completed the narrative that would outlive her. By the time she died, nothing depended on her anymore. That is the most frightening kind of power. Because it does not need to kill you to erase you. It only needs to make you irrelevant. Cleopatra understood that. She understood that survival inside a finished system is not life. It is preservation without purpose. Breathing without agency. Existing as an object whose meaning has already been assigned. Rome had turned her into evidence. Evidence of victory. Evidence of moral superiority. Evidence of inevitability. She refused to remain evidence. That refusal did not save her reputation. It did not rescue her dynasty. It did not undo Rome's triumph. But it denied Rome one thing it wanted most. Control over her final act. Rome wanted her alive and compliant. Or dead and displayed. What it received was death without permission. And that mattered even if it did not change the outcome. Because it reminds us of something uncomfortable. Power is never just about force. It is about who controls meaning after the force is applied. Cleopatra lost the war. She lost the state. She lost her children. But she exposed the mechanism. She showed us that empires do not simply conquer land. They conquer memory. They conquer interpretation. They conquer the story people will tell long after the soldiers are gone. And if we are not careful, we inherit those stories without questioning who wrote them and why. For 2,000 years, Cleopatra was remembered the way Rome needed her to be remembered. Not as a ruler. Not as a strategist. Not as a survivor of impossible political pressure. But as a symbol emptied of substance. That does not happen because history is careless. It happened because history is curated. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. You start noticing the pauses. The delays. The missing weeks. The quiet transitions where nothing explodes, but everything changes. You start asking who benefited from the version you were taught. Cleopatra's final captivity was not dramatic. It was procedural. And procedure is where power hides best. So remember her correctly. Not as the woman with the snake, but as the ruler who recognized that Rome had replaced her future before she ever left her palace. Remember that her silence was not ignorance. It was clarity. And remember that history does not always destroy its enemies. Sometimes it simply files them away. If this story changed how you see the past, that means it's working. Because history is not about what happened. It's about what we allow to be remembered. If you want more stories like this, Stories that examine not just collapse but what comes after. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment with what part of this story stayed with you. And ask yourself one last question. How many other figures did history quietly replace while we were busy watching the spectacle? That's where the real stories are buried.